Good morning, good evening, depending upon where you're at. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which, aside from me, includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome and many thanks to Aluf Benn, who joins us this morning from Israel. So for him, it's evening. It's been a dramatic month. Welcome and thanks as well to today's moderator, Patt Morrison. We're all very anxious to hear this program and to be more informed about what's going on in Israel from the perspective of Aluf. This week, our program returns to its usual day and time, Wednesday at 5. This week's guest is constitutional law scholar and dean of UC Berkeley School of Law, Erwin Chemerinsky. With our Constitution being at the center of so many issues right now, it'll be very important to hear what a renowned constitutional scholar thinks is going on. In March, we will conclude our 5th year of this weekly and sometimes twice weekly series, which began with the COVID quarantine in March 2020. In March, we will continue to examine the extraordinary legal and constitutional challenges facing our country today. In March, we will welcome 4 great experts on that subject: Michael Posner, Jennifer Rubin, Susan Glasser, and Harry Littman. We hope that you'll join us. In April, we'll embark on our 6th year of America at a Crossroads with equally compelling experts. We are grateful to our audience, and that's you. Your support enables us to continue our work and continue to pursue our mission. That mission is to ensure that we are all educated and informed with fact and data-based information, coupled with outstanding analysis by the very best experts. Thank you for joining us and for your commitment to staying informed and engaged. Look at the bottom of the email that you'll get right after this program ends to register for all of our upcoming programs. Now, please welcome today's moderator, Patt Morrison. Pat has had an impressive career as a columnist with the Los Angeles Times and as a TV and radio personality and host. She has won top recognition for her probing intellect by her peers and by the public in every position she has held. So we are pleased to have Pat on our America Crossroads team. Patt Morrison, the program is yours.
Thank you, Janice. Thanks to everyone on the leadership team and all of you for joining us on a Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, wherever you may be, as we continue this vital part of the series about what's going on in Israel, the relationships with Hamas and with the rest of the world. Aluf Benn joins us again. We're happy that he can. He is a career journalist who has been published in a number of international publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Foreign Affairs. Since 2011, he has been editor-in-chief at Haaretz, and we're very grateful that you could join us again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pat.
There's a lot of news about the hostages, the ceasefire deal, relationships with Hamas, but before we get to that, I want to situate this in a larger context. It's been a little more than a month since Donald Trump was sworn in as president, so I wanted to know how that's altered feelings in Israel about the war, about the relationship with the United States, and maybe even within Israel about President Benjamin Netanyahu.
Well, clearly, Netanyahu was waiting for the re-election of Donald Trump. And for a long time, he refrained from reaching that ceasefire and hostage deal with Hamas, because he wanted to give that achievement to Trump rather than to President Biden, who his team drafted the deal and negotiated for a long time. But only when Trump was, even before the swearing in, only when Trump's aides, Trump's team was involved, Netanyahu was willing to go forward. Clearly for him, being the first official visitor to Trump's White House in the second term was an important achievement, kind of triumph. Victorious visit, having Trump outflanking him from the right by suggesting the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, the relocation of 2 million Palestinians who live there elsewhere, and turning Gaza into kind of a resort for other people. I'm not sure that it really took Netanyahu by surprise. Maybe the idea that it would be part of the United States, but Trump was floating the idea from taking office. So for Netanyahu, it was a big boon. Netanyahu, for years, his main selling point in Israel was his English, his ability to speak to the goyim in their language, to give them a speech, and he couldn't have expected a heartier welcome than that. Unfortunately, he extended the visit, and on Saturday, when he was still in America, 3 hostages were returned from Hamas, who looked like Holocaust survivors released from Auschwitz or Buchenwald or a place like that, and that was obviously a devastating blow to Netanyahu's prestige. And the hostages that came later were in better shape, but still, everybody in Israel, for the first time, I think, a clear majority of Israeli public opinion has supported the conclusion of the hostages. Bring them home now, all of them. All of those 63 are still in Gaza, presumably 24 are still alive, and not waiting until second stage and stage this and that. So that became a national priority.
What about the feeling in Israel, the perception of Donald Trump and what he wants for Israel and his, in a sense, his attitude toward the rest of the Middle East, with, of course, Israel at the center of those calculations?
Well, I think that it depends on what kind of Israel we're talking about. The idea of the Gaza relocation and the resortification of Gaza is very popular in the Jewish public opinion in Israel. That is wary of the war and doesn't see any ability to coexist with Hamas or with the Palestinians. And clearly this serves the Israeli right wing, because the Israeli right wing has these designs of full annexation of the West Bank. And to them, Trump, who has no respect for the global border system, who has no respect for international law, for all those people in Israel who want to fight the Palestinians and drive them out with disregarding international law or any norms or history, Trump is a boon. Other people are more worried about Trump's lasting support for Israel when they realize that he was just willing to ditch Ukraine after a very big American investment in holding Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, fighting against the Russian attack. And some of the people in Israel are asking, will Trump one day turn against the military aid to Israel and say this is not a good investment either?
We are talking to Aluf Benn, who is the editor-in-chief of Haaretz. And if you have questions for him, we spend about the last 20 minutes of our time together putting your questions to him. You can put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them a little later in the program. The news over the course of the night was that Israel had delayed an expected release of the Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the returned Israeli hostages, quote, until further notice. This had to do in part with the propaganda displays that Hamas used before it released some of the prisoners, but they were called humiliating ceremonies. But what else is at work in these negotiations in the latest position that Israel has taken?
Well, Netanyahu is at the crossroads, just like the program is called, on 2 fronts. One is the war. Should Israel resume the war as he pledged until the eradication of Hamas? As he pledged, and not only pledged, he promised it to his far-right coalition partners who would otherwise leave the coalition and bring the government down. Or the first priority is bringing back the hostages. Bringing back the hostages entails full Israeli withdrawal from the remaining area that Israel controls in the Gaza Strip. It entails the release of thousands of Palestinian terrorists from Israeli prisons, and other Palestinians were arrested in Gaza. Were never stood trial in Israel, but regardless, it could appear as an Israeli defeat by Hamas. Because if after all this fighting and all the killing and damage and destruction in Gaza and in Israel, all we got is going back to the old lines, Hamas in power in Gaza, with full control of the territory, and having their thousands of terrorists back to rebuild their fighting force, this cannot appear as a big achievement to Israel. On the other hand, leaving the hostages there means, and resuming the fight means the death of the hostages, or presumably the death of the hostages. So it's a very, very tough decision on the part of Netanyahu. Add two other angles here. One is the American angle. Obviously, Israel is very attentive to the United States. It has very few friends at that level with that influence. And the Trump administration is, according to Witkoff, to the Trump emissary, fully behind conclusion of the deal, bringing back all the hostages, moving to stage two, concluding the war, and then finding a way to push Hamas aside and to do something else in Gaza. And the other angle is the other fronts. What we see is much more fighting going on in the West Bank in recent weeks, in which the Israeli forces cleared, depopulated 3 refugee camps around the Palestinian towns of Jenin and Tulkarm, and pushed aside, relocated, drove out 40,000 people. And today, the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz declared that they will not be allowed back for at least a year, which appears to be some kind of compensation for the far right, whose eyes have always been more on the West Bank than on Gaza, to tell them, okay, you're not going to get Gaza, you're not going to get new Jewish settlements in Gaza, but we're fighting in the West Bank. And that was further complicated when on Thursday, 4 or 5 buses exploded in a bus depot in Israel, and they were supposed to explode the next morning with hundreds of passengers on board. And that could have been a mega terrorist attack if succeeded. And the perpetrators apparently came from the West Bank. So that, again, is another motivation of Israel to launch a more serious military operation there. And then we have the Northern Front, in which also Israel made a display of force today during the funeral of the late Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. And then Netanyahu declared that Israel would prevent the new Syrian government from deploying any military forces from Damascus to the south of the country, which means that Israel is building a security zone inside Syria, which never happened before. All this converges to the decision: bring back the hostages, which enjoys immense public and American support, but risks the downfall of the government, or find a way to resume the war, keep the Palestinian prisoners in Israel, go back to Gaza to fight Hamas, assuming that you have some miracle plan that would succeed this time.
So it seems like the return of all the hostages would be a moment for a major shift, a major realignment, whether it would be a victory for the hostages, for their families, and for popular sentiment, but at the same time, Netanyahu would no longer have that as leverage.
Well, no, but also Hamas won't have that as leverage. But I think that to most Israelis, seeing the hostages, and especially the living hostages, back home, rescued from hell, from the depth of hell in Gaza, and the stories told by the returning hostages are very difficult to hear, about torture, about lying for months and a year in a dark tunnel with very little food, with their captors eating in front of them, and so on. It's difficult to hear. So we want these people back, first of all, for the sake of saving them and their families and society at large. But that doesn't mean that it's the final chapter of the war if any side wants to resume it. There's no peace negotiated between Israel and Hamas.
So where does that leave the ceasefire?
That's a big question. And clearly, by withholding the release of those 602 Palestinians from Israeli prisons last night, Netanyahu leaves open the ability to implode the deal and resume the fighting. Today we saw conflicting messages from both sides. So it's really one of the toughest decisions by Netanyahu and by Hamas throughout the war, this particular moment.
Who are these Palestinian prisoners who are set for release? Because that's been controversial every time it's happened.
Well, there are terrorists who were among the perpetrators, organizers of the Second Intifada. If you recall, 25 years ago, massive campaign of terrorist attacks in Israeli cities, mostly suicide bombers blowing buses and shopping malls and other public places. Well, the suicide bombers obviously killed themselves, but those people who sent them, who armed them, who gave them orders, and so on, were eventually captured and have been in prison for 25 years. And these people are the worst enemies of Israel. Then you have some people from even before. Then you have other people who carried out terrorist attacks in more recent years. And then you have hundreds of people arrested, and then you have about 200 people arrested on October 7, the perpetrators of the massacre of October 7 in the kibbutzim and the military bases around Gaza. And then you have hundreds of other people arrested in Gaza as suspects, or, since there were no charges brought against them, so we don't really know who they are and why they were arrested en masse.
You have
and they were most of those who were prepared for release last night were from Gaza, not from the Second Intifada, although some of them were.
If you have a question for Aluf Benn, please put it in the Q&A box, and we'll get to it a little later in the program, as we always like to bring your questions to the front. A lot of the schematics of the Mideast have shifted around in the wake of some of these things that have happened and things that have not happened. One of them is that Hezbollah is going to use the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah, who's one of its leaders, who was killed, as a big show of force to try to rally support for Hezbollah among its potential allies or supporters, and also as well, maybe a kind of middle finger to Israel?
Well, clearly in the north, unlike the south, after about a year of attrition, Israel delivered a severe blow to Hezbollah. It killed its entire leadership, or almost its entire leadership. Even more importantly, the Israeli Air Force destroyed most of the missile force of Hezbollah that was built in order to be able to destroy Tel Aviv and create huge damage in Israel. And they were also their ground forces were also driven away from the border. And Israeli army is now holding positions on the other side of the border to defend some of the Israeli villages and towns along the border. So that was a major victory for Israel. And clearly they want to show that, and then after that, their political stranglehold over Lebanon was weakened, and they had to move aside, and Lebanon elected a president after several years without functioning government. And today this president, Joseph Aoun, said that it's enough for Lebanon to be part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to pay a price for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it should strive for the two-state solution like the rest of the official Arab League position. And clearly Hezbollah wanted to show during Nasrallah's funeral that they're still a formidable force within Lebanon, and they could still be calling the shots or be involved in calling the shots in Lebanon. They also lost their ally Bashar Assad. The Syrian regime also collapsed under the strain of the war, although it wasn't a goal, and Assad was very careful not to take sides, but it wasn't enough to save him, and his enemies brought him down. He escaped, and now we have a different government in Syria.
Where does that government in Syria stand, and does it have any usefulness for Israel and for regional politics?
Well, first of all, it's not a key, strong ally of Iran in the same way that Assad and his father were. So that was a major achievement for Israel. The other thing was that right after the upheaval in Syria, the Israeli Air Force destroyed most of the assets, or the long-range assets, of the defunct Syrian army. Warships, warplanes, chemical arms factories, long-range missiles, etc., and captured several positions on the Syrian side. which means kind of long-term occupation of parts of Syria and creating an Israeli security zone within Syria. And now this new Syrian government has other problems to deal with rather than Israel, and they don't want to have issues with Israel. But their strong backer, President Erdogan of Turkey, is not a big fan of Israel, and clearly some tension is building, and someday would explode. But at this time, it's still a very, as it was before, a relatively quiet border. The problem is that Israel is trying to boast about controlling this or that area in Syria and preventing the Syrians from doing this and that. And once this government gains power, they might be less than happy about it.
How is Iran reassessing its own strength in this argument, given the attack on Nasrallah, the death of Nasrallah, and other defeats of elements of Hezbollah?
Well, Iran, the major blow to Iran was the fall of the Assad regime, because that was really the main pipeline of Iranian power projection in this part of the region. The other thing was the two missile attacks by Iran on Israel. The last one in October ended with no casualties or serious damage in Israel, but some of these missiles hit the ground in Israel and exploded. Israel retaliated by destroying the Iranian air defenses, which opened up the big debate that has been going on in Israel on and off for 25 years. Should Israel bomb the nuclear facilities in Iran in order to forcefully block it from reaching the bomb, as Israel did in Iraq in 1981, Syria 2007. With Iran, it's far more complicated from a military standpoint. And to this day, there's been no green light by the United States for such an operation, which would entail American involvement in supplies, in intelligence, in protecting Israel before and after, and so on and so forth. President Trump, hawkish as he might be otherwise, declared his idea of reaching a new deal with Iran and using the threat of force as a kind of bargain chip for diplomacy, to which the Iranians responded in kind that there's something to talk about. So this is a very tense period, because from a military standpoint, once the clouds of winter are cleared in the Middle East, the lack of air defenses, the lack of allies along the route is tempting for any Israeli military planner to fly to Iran and destroy these facilities. There has been already fighting going on directly between Israel and Iran, so it's the second stage. It's not for the first time, but it's very complicated, and I don't know if the capability exists, and I don't know what would be the American angle with that. All the previous administrations did not like Israel to hit Iran. Neither the Bush administration, the Obama administration, Trump, Biden, and Trump again. So it's a very, very complicated problem. But at the same time, Iran every day is inching closer toward the bomb. So I think this is the hardest flashpoint around the region.
One of the terms that you used was the resortification of Gaza, and I think it was when the King of Jordan was visiting the White House that that Donald Trump suggested that Jordan and Egypt, among others, take all of the people, all of the Palestinians as refugees, and essentially clear out Gaza and rebuild it as a resort community of the sort that he evidently admires. Yeah. And so what sort of reception did that get? You mentioned that there are a lot of people in Israel who like the idea of getting Gazans out of Gaza, but this seems to be, if these are the plans of the United States in terms of its relationship with regional changes in the regional future, how does that look from Israel's point of view practically, not just, well, gee, it would be great, but?
Practically and morally, it's a very, very bad idea. First of all, driving out people from their homes, even those who have declared refugees after 1948 and live in UN-managed refugee camps, or have lived, because now they're all relocated in tent cities, temporary housing in southern Gaza, southwest Gaza. But so first of all, it's a war crime if you push them out. Now the Israeli officials are saying, no, this is kind of a travel agency. We'll just open the border, and whoever wants to immigrate will facilitate it. And out of the sudden, many people in the Israeli right wing who before that argued that there were no innocent people in Gaza and all of Gaza is Hamas and so on. Now they're very worried about the humanitarian situation. They want the Gazans to have better life. That's from the moral and legal point of view. To call the Israeli reserves and send these people to invade Gaza again in order to drive people out, even if it's just convincing them by force to go out and they sign some pledge that they do it voluntarily, that's a very big problem. But even to those who care less about morals and legality, you have practical issues. To Jordan and Egypt, an influx of 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, led by Hamas, a very radical Islamic group, regardless of its fight against Israel and its anti-Zionist stance. It also has very strong links with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and with other Islamist group in Jordan. It's a risk to the stability of these governments. And these are the most important peace partners of Israel for decades, very important strategic partners of Israel for decades. Why threaten them with an influx of refugees? And also these people could go on fighting Israel from the neighboring countries. So it's not a very smart idea, even if you put aside the very bad legal and moral aspects of this cleansing, then strategically it's a blunder.
Well, I think people remember when President Sadat of Egypt was killed by people who opposed the peace accords that he had been reaching with the United States. So that possibility of destabilization internally must be top of mind too for these nations that Trump sort of breezily proposed be the travel destinations for all Gazans.
Of course, and especially for Jordan, where you have the majority of the population has been since 1948 composed of Palestinian refugees and their descendants, and there's always a very delicate balance of power between the Hashemite regime and the Palestinian majority in the country, and you don't want to destabilize it. And again, there are those people in the Israeli right wing who have argued for ages that given that demography, Jordan is Palestine, so the Palestinians should be driven out to Jordan, have a state there. The Israeli establishment, by and large, opposed the idea and viewed Jordan since even before the establishment of Israel, the Hashemites as strategic partners, and they still are, regardless of the bad rapport between Prime Minister Netanyahu and King Abdullah. And I think it's going to be a very, very bad mistake to destabilize Jordan.
So when Netanyahu swears he's going to resume the war in Gaza, what is that beyond rhetoric? What does it practically mean?
Well, I'm not privy to the operational plans, as you might expect, but the idea is to find some military way to do away with Hamas, either through full occupation or through shifting the balance of power in a way that the remaining leaders of Hamas in Gaza will go to exile, and some other people would take their place in managing the territory. Look, these hostage release ceremonies were used by Hamas not just to humiliate hostages or Israel or the Israeli army or to win or to score diplomatic points, but also to show that they are pretty much the power in charge in the Gaza Strip, that they are still armed and dangerous and can fight. It's obviously, you don't see divisions there. You see several dozens of people with rifles. It's not a serious military force, but the message is clear. There's no alternative, because whoever will try to replace Hamas in Gaza, they're going to fight them. So it's a big question, and the Israeli government so far has refrained from offering the resumption of the Palestinian Authority rule in Gaza, as there was until Hamas took over. And why? Because for the Israeli, some of the people in the Israeli right who are in cabinet, the Palestinian Authority is even a worse enemy than Hamas because of its international legitimacy. And that's why for many years Netanyahu and his supporters supported the funding of Hamas by Qatar, the easing of all kinds of restrictions on Hamas in order to keep them alive as a counterbalance to a globally supported Palestinian Authority that might lead to a Palestinian state.
What's left of the ceasefire and the negotiations in the second stage? The U.S. Special Envoy for the Mideast, Steve Witkoff, said this week that negotiations have entered a difficult stage, but he remains optimistic. Is he blowing smoke, or is there reason for that?
Well, so far he has proved that that he's been able to extract decisions from Netanyahu to move forward on the first stage. Netanyahu was hesitant on that as well. The second stage, as I mentioned before, is far more difficult politically and otherwise for the Israeli government. But I think Witkoff will try to find some way at least to bring back the hostages and to stabilize the situation, and then trying to negotiate some successor regime to Hamas in Gaza. It's very easy to say it here to the audience. It's a very, very delicate, complicated diplomatic job for Witkoff.
Well, here's where the United States and Israel may part company, because Israel may be looking for a way to scrap this deal and get out of it, while in the United States, Trump has, even though this was negotiated by Biden, has something of a stake in his reputation about making this a success, does he not?
Yes, and also he has a stake in, or at least an aspiration, which, by the way, was shared by the Biden administration as well, to make peace or to mediate peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia, to normalize the relationship. And clearly, with war resumed in Gaza, with the entailed damage, destruction, casualties, and so on and so forth, and the delay of any aspiration for a Palestinian state, the Saudis are not going to run to make peace with Israel with the war going on. So there is not just sticks for Israel here, but also carrots. And this is very important for Trump. And I believe that most Israelis would support peace with Saudi Arabia overwhelmingly, as they supported the previous accords with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, with Sudan, in the first Trump term, 2020. So it's a very complicated structure here. But you see that Netanyahu is pushing the war to the east, to the West Bank, to the north, to Syria, to Lebanon, to deflect some of the political pressure from the right to reinvade Gaza, and to say, okay, we can live with that ceasefire because we have other challenges. We want to prevent terror attacks from the West Bank. We need to fight Hamas there. We need to impose the ceasefire in Lebanon. We need to deal with Iran. Let's follow Trump on Gaza. I think this is what Netanyahu is trying to do here, and the bonus is bringing back the hostages and supporting some sort of, or beginning some sort of national healing from the horrors of the war on October 7 and the aftermath.
Setting aside Trump and the United States in this, the shifting alignments, the moves in politics in Europe, and how they're affecting Israel. Very, very early numbers, and I just glanced at them first thing this morning, seem to be favoring the right in elections in Germany, and we know what that has certainly boded in the past. How is Israel assessing these changes?
Well, the current Israeli government is a big ally of the far-right parties in Europe. I'm not saying that specifically the AfD in Germany, but with the government of Hungary, with far-rightists in Sweden, in Romania, and elsewhere, because of the feeling of shared animosity, of the anti-Muslim sentiment of the far-right in Europe, and which is shared by the Israeli right wing. So these people, regardless of the anti-Semitic past of some of these parties and their members of leadership, appear to be allies of the far-right Israel. And again, it's a realignment. Europe is weak. In the past, European public opinion, let alone the European diplomatic opinion, was very important to Israeli policymakers. In recent years, with the rise of, the cracks in the European Union, with Britain defecting, and then the rise of the more conservative countries of the former Soviet bloc, that traditionally they have no remorse or guilt feelings about colonialism. They have they bear no responsibility for the establishment of Israel, for the Palestinian Nakba in 1948, for the drawing of the borders of the Middle East that still alienates many people in the region. And they came across as much more pro-Israeli from their entry to the EU. And today they are far more powerful because the EU struggled to maintain any coherence inside. And there is no clear leader of Europe in the same way that Angela Merkel was for many years the Chancellor of Germany. The big question in Germany is whether the other parties would unite to block the far right, the AfD, from joining a coalition and leave them out, or somehow the AfD would be able to sneak in. And as we saw, Trump and his key aide, supporter, enforcer, anyway you want to call it, Elon Musk and J.D. Vance in his speech in Munich, they all but lobbied and rallied for the AfD, with the vice president arguing that the Europeans should give these parties more place in the room. And why are you shutting them out? So that's a big realignment. But as I said, the Netanyahu government is, again, I'm not talking specifically about the AfD, but is very much aligned with these kind of parties all over Europe. And again, these parties are not big supporters of international law, of the International Criminal Court, of all these organs that the Israeli right doesn't like.
I have a question for you to, I hope, wrap up my end of this and move on to the audience questions. And that is,
Sure.
what's the sense of, and I haven't heard anything about it for a long time, that Trump's choice to be ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, doesn't seem to be playing much of a public role, and his evangelical Christianity and the role of Jews in the biblical interpretations of that part of Christianity are pretty clear. Where is Huckabee, and what's the sense of him?
Well, first of all, he's not been a big public player so far. I think that as far as the American administration, the current administration in Israel, involved, Steve Witkoff takes center stage, rather than the more pragmatic deal maker, businessman sort of person, rather than politician and evangelical. But I think that the interesting, and I think what tells it all, is that during his visit to Washington, Netanyahu met the evangelicals, but not the Jewish organizations. Which again, this is a realignment of alliances that's been going on for over a decade, mostly championed by Ron Dermer, who's now Netanyahu's chief diplomat as Minister of Strategic Affairs, and before that, ambassador to Washington for years. Dermer, for years, argued that Israel's new allies should be the evangelicals because they are growing in numbers and influence and so on, while liberal Jews are turning away from Israel, and the Orthodox Jews are not enough in demography and political power in the state to make a difference. And we see that this is happening. So this alliance is the same alliance in the United States as well, and Mike Huckabee is a prime representative of that. So I don't think that while in Israel, I don't believe that he would talk about Armageddon and the second coming and what would happen to the Jews with these prophecies and so on, but rather talk about settlements. He's a big supporter of the West Bank Jewish settlements and about other shared values of the American and Israeli right wing.
Let's take some questions from you. And we have several people who have asked about the possibility for long-term peace without a Palestinian state versus with a Palestinian state.
Look, I'm an old supporter of the two-state solution mostly because of the dignity and respect to the other people. It is, and I haven't changed my mind. I'm not one of those sobered up left-wingers in Israel who change their minds because of October 7, because of the war. And but it's a very minority position, a small minority position in Israel these days. Look, what do you mean? We mean by long-term peace? You know, for 15 years or so before, 18 years before October 7, Israel prospered and all but lived by Netanyahu's idea that you can prosper and have some kind of conflict, low-level conflict, and just pay the other side, let them live at some point above the poverty line, and they will not fight you. But as we see, this doesn't work. At the same time, it's very difficult to see any kind of negotiated long-term settlement with Hamas because they don't want to coexist with Israel. And their willingness to sacrifice the destruction of Gaza, the killing of so many people, just in order to be able to raise their flag and say we never surrendered, that doesn't, unlike the PLO or Fatah in the 90s and 1980s, they never tried the diplomatic card. For years they argued against the siege of Gaza, but they never once tried to make even the most ambiguous statement about the recognition of Israel or coexistence with Israel that would have given them more leeway internationally and which would translate into more pressure on Israel to ease the blockade. No, to them, the destruction of Israel is a top priority. So it's very difficult to see how you reconcile all these things together. But again, I think that the two-state solution is still the best way to look at long-term peace. And we see that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, despite all the hardship it went through under the current government and the ongoing growth of Israeli settlements and Israeli military operations in the West Bank, etc., still it strongly cooperates with Israel on security. And in the areas where it has control, it controls them quite peacefully. So you can, and then I'm old enough to remember how Egyptians fought Israelis and how Jordanians fought Israelis, and these things can change, but it's a very, very hard sell today.
Marilyn has a follow-on to your comments about Syria, whether you think Israel is in danger of extending the war or some other version of it to take over in Syria.
Well, today Netanyahu announced for the first time that Israel is now not just protecting itself in Syria, but also protecting the Druze minority in southern Syria, where you have the most important enclave, Jabal Druze, the Druze mountain, the most important enclave of the Druze community historically and regionally. And Israel declared that it demands the demilitarization of southern Syria and will prevent the new government from deploying forces there in order to protect the Druze minority. This is a very unprecedented policy by Israel, let alone a declared policy that you deploy force to protect other people. I mean, Israel did that to some extent in the 1970s and early 80s in Lebanon with the Christians. It didn't end up so well for either side. And but clearly Israel is going to have this security zone in Syria for the foreseeable future, which even if now it's quiet, it might entail problems in the future.
We have heard this reasoning before. I mean, it was used by the Germans in the 1930s about the German-speaking population, I think, in Czechoslovakia. You had...
well, that's what Putin argued about the Russian-speaking people in Eastern Ukraine. It still does, by the way.
Yeah. So it seems like it's a popular argument, but not necessarily a legitimate one.
Well, when I look at it from Netanyahu's perspective, I realized for quite a while during the war that one of the major things that he would like to be told about himself by a future historian was that he is the person who expanded the borders of Israel after 50 years of shrinking, of Israel withdrawing from the Sinai and almost from the Golan and from the security zone in Lebanon and from parts of the West Bank and from Gaza. And he would be the one to take back and then some. And the incursion into Syria is a prime example of that. Now, if you have the American president who argues that the entire international border system is not sacred and should be redrawn at will, then Israel could take its own part. Israel was never a big fan of the international border system, as we know, and has been living with occupied territories for decades now in the West Bank, in Gaza and Jerusalem without international recognition. So why not add some more in Syria? But it also means that, and that's kind of a lesson of October 7, that Israel cannot protect itself from its sovereign borders. And it must deploy forces on the other side in order to protect itself from that kind of incursion and eventual massacre as it happened.
Israel would like to know about the chances for new elections before the official current term is over.
Another big crossroad for Netanyahu next month in March. By the end of March, the budget must pass. Otherwise, the government collapses. The government faces two challenges. You have the ultra-Orthodox demanding a law, the ultra-Orthodox youth are not drafted. So and it's not legal. The Supreme Court thrown out the legal arrangement that enabled the Haredis not to be drafted. And now the government needs to come up with a new law. But with the war going on, with thousands of non-Haredi Israelis killed or wounded or traumatized, and the military in dire need to expand its ground forces, for the first time the military changed its mind and said, yeah, we need the ultra-Orthodox kids, and we're willing to build special units that would enable them to keep their religious practice, their observant practices, while serving as fighters. The ultra-Orthodox rabbis and politicians oppose that, and they want a discharge law, a law that would just free them from the draft and from military service. The other religious parties, the national religious, they are among the graduates of today's officers' school, in the combat unit, the infantry officers' school. About 80% are national religious, which means that they have a stake in the military. They see it as a very important organ. They're willing to serve. They're willing to sacrifice their lives for it. And they can't take the other religious side, the ultra-Orthodox, saying, no, our religion prevents us from serving in the military. And they say, why? We are just as religious as you are. And we serve and we fight and we get killed and wounded and the prisoner of war and all that. So if you resume the war, the public outcry for Haredi draft may drive out the ultra-Orthodox. If you stop the war, then the ultra-Orthodox might have their day with Netanyahu and the draft exemption, but then the national religious would say, hey, how could you do that? So that's the crossroads in the government. Can Netanyahu keep together the coalition with the ultra-Orthodox, with the far right, the national religious, and his own party, and lead through another year and a half until the designated election, or call an early election on his terms before this summer, with the hostages back home, with his presumed main rival, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, just disorganized and not organized enough to find his own party and so on. that remains to be seen. But that's a decision Netanyahu must take next month.
Also about Netanyahu, Catherine wants to know the status of the legal cases that are pending against him and what you think is going to happen.
Well, his dragging is now in the defense part of his corruption trial, and here his lawyers are dragging his testimony. It was supposed to be 3 days a week, and once one day is sick, one day is going to do an operation, one day is having some sort of important security stuff. So he's dragging it and dragging it and dragging it. And this trial has been dragged for 5 years. And it's not going anywhere, and they haven't even covered one of the 3 cases in full, and then they have other defense witnesses. So it's going to take a long time. There's always the idea of plea bargain or presidential pardon in the air, but Netanyahu refused to take that if that entails his retirement. And so far, he wants to go on.
Philip wants to know, or he says the refusal to give up the so-called right of return has been a major impediment to the two-state solution. Is there a Palestinian leader who would give that up to achieve peace? And would it just be essentially a paper declaration, given that the actual movement of Gazans seems to be very much not on anybody else's agenda?
Well, that's the biggest question of all. I don't know. So far it failed. And interim agreements tend to be tempting either side to catch as much as they can. But the truth of the matter is that diplomacy is stuck in 2000, the failed Camp David peace conference. I remember I covered it as diplomatic correspondent back in the day, and we're still waiting now for the Saudi carrot to pave the way for it. The Arab League initiative is ambiguous about it. I mean, it can be read as saying that the right of return exists and must be implemented. It can be read as saying that this is some kind of slogan that you can keep living with. But it was never negotiated in earnest. Israel never agreed to open the negotiations on the basis of the Arab Peace Initiative, and never came up with its own peace initiative or counter initiative.
We have a question from Arnold about whether there will be a commission of inquiry about the Gaza war, just as there was after the Yom Kippur War, and what do you think might come of it?
Well, Netanyahu so far has been able to prevent it politically. He's afraid of it. He doesn't like it, although no commission of inquiry ever fired or suggested to fire a prime minister. He had a very bad conclusion by the outgoing commission of inquiry about the disaster in Meron several years ago, with the largest civilian disaster in Israel's history. He was blamed for it by the commission of inquiry. Nothing happened. He was blamed by an ongoing commission of inquiry on a submarine deal, corrupt submarine deal. He was warned that he might face consequences. Nothing happened. So I don't think that he's really got anything to fear. The only sensitive area that I see here, there are 2 sensitive areas. First of all, Netanyahu rejects all responsibility for the October 7 disaster, and he puts the blame squarely on the side of the army and the anti-government protesters, the pre-war protests that weakened Israel and tempted the enemy to attack. Number 2, so Commission of Inquiry would definitely find a lot of fault on the military, on the intelligence services, etc. But it might also blame Netanyahu. So first of all, he doesn't like it. And the other thing is that there is one sensitive area to Netanyahu, and that is the pre-war relationship with Hamas through Qatar. Why did he lobby the Qataris to fund Hamas, which now appears to be the worst debacle of all, because the Qataris said they would fund only social services, etc., but that enabled Hamas to move the other funds to military buildup. And I don't think Netanyahu would like to see that part of history aired by a commission of inquiry. It's a very sensitive topic for him.
A quick addendum to that, Linda wants to know whether the idea of not having sufficient military presence at the border, not taking the intelligence seriously. Are these serious accusations, or the fact that they're against the Israeli military implicitly, at least some in the high command, would also keep them from coming to a court of inquiry at the level that might resolve these questions?
No, the military leaders, from the outgoing Defense Minister Gallant all the way down to the heads of the former head of military intelligence and the outgoing military chief of staff, the current head of security service, all supported in public commission of inquiry, and they said they would cooperate, and they took responsibility. Netanyahu bears responsibility mainly because before the war, during the judicial overhaul and the anti-government protest, those chiefs came time and again to him and warned him that war was impending, that there was a clear and present danger of war. They did not say Hamas. They said they thought about Hezbollah or Iran, but they said that there is a risk of war. And he refused to hold serious negotiations about it because he believed that their motivations were political, that they were aligning themselves with their former commanders protesting on the other side of across the street from military headquarters. And he refused to deal with it. His main defense is that first, most of them told him that Hamas was deterred. And the other thing that was when the last minute warning signs came on the last night before October 7, they did not bother to call him and wake him up and tell him something wrong was going on in Gaza. So he said they didn't call me. If they would, I would change the situation. But it's a very difficult position to defend because you had 6 months or 7 months almost from the Gallant warning all the way through October 7th to hold discussions about the upcoming war, and you didn't. But again, they didn't either. I mean, they gave those warnings, and they didn't make sure that all the borders were protected as they should have been.
So there would be not any particular finger pointing, just a general failure or human failure in that?
I think that the main failure here, just like in '73, the Yom Kippur War, and other historic strategic surprises, throughout military history, is the failure to realize and to anticipate, to imagine the enemy daring to do such a thing. Because you think the enemy was too weak, because you think you have superior intelligence, because they never believed Hamas would dare to carry out such an operation. And that's why, even though the Hamas plan was known to Israeli intelligence, it got stuck in mid-levels, because the mid-levels never believed it to be so serious to pass it on to the highest levels. And the highest levels were not suspicious enough to ask, what if they're not as weak and stupid and frightened of us as we think, as they thought they were. And I think that was their main reason for the failure.
Mr. Benn, as you know, we spend the last couple of minutes of this program trying to look optimistically at aspects of what it is we've been discussing over the course of the hour. So maybe you can rouse some of that for us and give people some hope and some direction.
The first order of hope is the return of the hostages. It's the most pressing issue for us. And then, obviously, if you could replace Hamas with a more moderate force that you could coexist with and build different relationship with, and then negotiate a wider peace deal all over the region, and build a path to a two-state solution, that could be great. Clearly, the current American administration has much more leverage over any Israeli government than its predecessor. For obvious reasons. Israel has no other friends, and given the administration's control, the Republican control of Congress, there's no way you can play the parties against each other as Netanyahu masterfully did with the Republicans and the Obama administration and the Biden administration, time and again. So if they are as serious as they are about making peace, let's support them. But first, they should bring the hostages back home.
Aluf Benn, it always enlightens us to hear from you, and I hope we'll be able to have you back again to do the same as these matters unfurl. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I hope to come with better news next time.
Thank you. We hope so too. We want you to listen to all of our programs coming up later this week. We have the constitutional scholar Erwin Chemerinsky, and then also later on, Michael Posner talking with Madeline Brand about social media and democracy, an issue, as I can tell from your questions, of urgent concern to so many of you. So we want to thank you all for watching, especially at this unusual time on a Sunday, joining us for our other programs and supporting them when you can. And thanks again to the people who organize this wonderful, vital program every week, sometimes twice a week. Lucky you. I'm Patt Morrison. Thank you.